Hello, welcome to week 4. This week we're going to be talking about the structural approach, or Minuchin's theories. We'll focus on subsystems, structures, and boundaries mostly. But let's dive in.
Okay, structural family therapy. It's one of the main models of family therapy, and I think there's some real concrete things that you can do to learn the main concepts and prepare for the licensing exam. Um, First of all, you should know that structural family therapy is a model that provides a framework about how to conceptualize, work, and help families change. It also provides guidance on your role as a therapist. It was originally developed by Salvador Minuchin at the Philadelphia Child Guidance Clinic. And I'm going to provide you with some links to some actual therapy done by him. I think that's one of the best ways to learn his approach. One of the things I really was always drawn to is that his approach is one of the few family therapy models that was not originally developed to serve the wealthy. He started his work really trying to design ideas and theories and techniques that could work with people with less economic advantage. The paradigm, basically, it's a structural view of families. It's focused on the structure. So it's examining the patterns that unify the meaning within a family. So he really was paying attention from the very beginning, where people sat, how they interacted, who spoke first, who didn't speak, and the sort of patterns that had developed and might be maintaining the problems that the families are experiencing. For example, I might look at distribution of power, the styles of conflict resolutions, and so forth. He's using the core systems theories, concepts, recursion, and others that we've talked about, but he's really looking at the structure. He does rather than genograms like that we talked about last week. He did structural maps. He was mapping out sort of the dynamics within the family. The family is conceptualized as a system in evolution that constantly regulates its own functioning. For example, he looks at closeness and distance, who's included and who's excluded from interactions. Are the boundaries within the family fluid or rigid? Solution-focused therapy looks at the organization flaw within the family, whatever it is. That's like, it's not about health and dysfunction necessarily. It's about what's working and what isn't working. So Minuchin's view of human nature, I think, is important to understand. He thought that families and members exist within a structure. Structures are built through repetitive family interactions. We've talked a little bit about that earlier with just core systems concepts. There is a natural order to life, and generational roles include grandparents, extended families, parents, children, etc. He did focus a lot on hierarchy. Hierarchy is made up of both a hard side and a soft side. Usually problems are created when the parental subsystem is inconsistent in its use of both sides. For example, when one parent is hard on the other and the other is soft, like there's an imbalance. People get sort of often to extremes, like, well, I'm extra soft with the child because she's extra hard with the child. That's a kind of an example. That makes sense. Like, everything makes sense. It's a balance of in a recursive pattern. But when people are limited to only one role within that, then I think that becomes a problem. He focused so much on structure. So if you're seeing a test question that says structure, it's a good possibility that it's talking about structural family therapy. Structure exists for a reason. There's a function of symptoms, and they're often hinting at a problem within the structure, most often in complement with others. He looked at flexibility. Is there permeable boundaries and roles? Has a family adapted to changes through the life cycle? He looks at complementary versus parallel relationship. We've talked sort of about that before. He did tune into competition. Is there ganging up on each other in order to win? He looked a lot at hierarchy. So review that concept in particular as you're studying for the test. And he talked about chaos, a lack of observable structure. I always think about this in terms of developmental. I would take the ideas of developmental theories. Sometimes, children are in charge of what's happening in the family, and some of you may be against hierarchy, but developmentally, the children are not able to be in the role of the parent. There's some developmental tasks that haven't occurred yet, and so that can be really problematic. Okay, boundaries range from rigid to diffuse. Rigid are when the rules are set in stone and are not flexible. You also talk about disengage, a member of the family that is not involved with others. Diffuse boundaries are ones that are not well defined, that are confusing. Like it's not really sure what the rules of the system are. Similar to what we talked about last week, he did tune into like enmeshment when there's an over involvement with the family or member of the family at the expense of growth or change. Overdoing support, over functioning. If you think about it in terms of recursion, if someone is over functioning, what complements that? Under functioning. So yeah. Okay, Mnuchin's focused on the couple subsystem. Subsystems are a big part of it. Like how do you break down the family into different systems? I mean, every family has different subsystems. Is the couple subsystem a partnership, or is it that they're against each other? Are there covert or overt rules that are agreed upon either tacitly or otherwise that keep them stable in the face of potential change? Or can they accommodate, which is the process of reciprocal agreements? So I'll come back to the mapping in a bit. When there is problems, it's often that there's inflexible structures. So for example, like I think about like maybe there was some rules with a 8-year-old, and that worked for a while the child was 8. But now if the child is 17 and the same rules are being applied and there's not adaptation taking place, then problems can occur because the child needs increasing amounts of freedom in different ways as they develop. Attention is paid to proximity and distance between family members and subsystems, and these are defined through boundaries or rules which determine who participates and how. Mnuchin focused on the extremes of the proximity and distance continuum, so between enmeshment and disengagement. So yeah, you got to be careful. I think with this, like if you see questions on this, you'll need to look for other clues to see whether it's Mnuchin or Bowen that they're talking about, because both of them sort of talked about those ideas. A family is described or schematized spatially in terms of its hierarchies and alliances and its coalitions. Problems result from rigid, dysfunctional family structures. Note that the use of the word, again, like I think I mentioned this, is that dysfunctional is not meant to get in the way of, from, it's not meant to be like a diagnosis. It's about what's working and what's not working. Okay, there's also problems when hierarchies are weak and ineffective. I love Oregon. That was one of my favorite places I've lived in my life. But it's very influenced by hippie culture. And as a part of this, like I would have parents come in and say, we don't understand why our child is doing this. We sat down, we talked to him, we tried to have a dialogue about the rules, maybe about curfews and things like that, and that we're just not getting anywhere. But they're treating the child as a co-parent. They're trying to have it be all collaborative, and sometimes that just isn't healthy for the child. And so, yeah. Anyways, tangential, but I thought hippie culture sort of contributed to this happening a little bit more. Please forgive me if you're a hippie. I love hippies. Anyways, maybe there's rules like men don't cry, women belong in the home, children should be seen and not heard. And sometimes if those are so rigid, then it causes problems. So how does he go about changing things? There's a few different ways to do this. You can alter the structure. You can alter the boundaries. You can try and realign subsystems. And one of the main things I think of when I think about Mnuchin's approach is establishing a healthy hierarchy. There is a concept, I don't know if he specifically called it this, but the idea of benevolent hierarchy. Hierarchy, I think, has gotten a bad name. But in families, it's a necessary thing. It's a part of leadership. Okay, reframe definitions of problems or assumptions of life. For example, Eduardo needs his space, and his parents should not check up on him. Yet Eduardo's been busted for doobies. Okay, I should update my thing because that's not the right lingo. But anyways, if there's a problem going on, then maybe there needs to be. The parents do need to be checking on him more. So it sort of depends what's going on in the system. The kind of relationship that Mnuchin tried to encourage, well, he would really focus on joining. When you watch the clip this week, watch how he connects with different people. And I was watching it, even as he ended, he goes around and he shakes everybody's hands. So he starts and he ends well with all members of the family. Meeting all members of the family where they are and making them feel welcome. It doesn't mean that he doesn't later get to a point where he's challenging them, but he starts off by really focusing on joining. Language, he focuses on that, using the language of the family. So if they're using this family, we really got a root hog or die. That's a term I learned in Louisiana. If you don't know it, you'll have to Google it. Root hog or die. But if he heard a family saying that, then maybe he would utilize that in the interventions that he prescribed. Behavior tracking and accommodation to the family's present views of the problem in family life. Like he joins them sort of where they're at, and then he starts to introduce newness. Attempts to project all the problems on the identified patients are met with, yes, but we need your help. If one member of the family is having a problem, it affects everyone. We can't change Johnny without your help. Like we start to make it a family challenge as opposed to an individual challenge. And sometimes I think he's just exploring who could hold the problem a little bit better. So maybe a lot of times all the problems get put on the least powerful person within the system. So maybe it's going to be shifted to a little bit of the responsibility to more powerful members of the system, often the parents. The basic goal is to induce a more adequate family organization of the sort that will maximize growth and potential in each of its members. The thrust of therapy is towards restructuring the system, such as establishing or loosening boundaries. I like this idea because it's like there's no one way of being as a family. There's so many different ways to be in the world. But if it's not working, then let's see if we can change it in a way that does work for the family. And what works for one family might not work for the other. So it's not like a recipe book. But focuses on differentiating enmeshed members and increasing the involvement of disengaged members. That's a common practice. The therapeutic plan is gauged against knowledge of what is normal for a family at a given stage in its development, and with due consideration of its cultural and socioeconomic context. There's techniques such as unbalancing a system and intensifying an interaction that are part of his therapy. The therapist joins and accommodates to the system in a sort of blending experience, but retains enough independence both to resist the family's pull and to challenge and restructure it. Thus, he actively uses himself as a boundary maker, intensifier, and general change agent. You could think of this, I'm sorry, because we talked about Bowen, now I'm thinking about this, but you could think about it like he's actively triangulating himself within the system. I shouldn't do that because that just confuses things. But he inserts himself into the system and becomes part of it so that he can use his sense of his self in order to change the system. Sorry, delete that whole part that I mentioned about Mnuchin, but I still think of it that way. Treatment is limited to include those members of a family who live within a household or have regular contact with the immediate family. However, this might involve grandparents living nearby, or an employer, or a priest, or a pastor, or others if the problem is if they're related to the problem that they're addressing. The practice is to bring a family to a level of health or complexity. I don't know why I just thought of this, but if you haven't watched it, watch The Danger of a Single Story. It's one of my favorite things, and it affects everything I do as a therapist now, because I'm always thinking about, like, okay, part of the challenge is that they're stuck in a singularity of ways of being. So I love that Mnuchin's trying to help them to become more complex. So they're ready to, in the future, if necessary, to be able to handle changes. Such a model is seen to combine the advantages of short and long-term therapies. One of the things he also does is notice problematic behavior sequences. This can also be done by asking what happens then, and then what happens. Sort of. I do this by drawing out a behavioral cycle sometimes, where I say, okay, when he does this, then what does she do, and when she does that, what does he do, and vice versa if I'm working with a heterosexual couple. Initiate an enactment. So enactments, if you see that word, then you're talking about structural therapy. So if I have a client come in, and they're tell me, well, yeah, Saturday we had this real big blowout, and I might say something, well, it sounds like you're not quite finished with that. Could you show me how you two try to resolve that problem? And then I just kind of sit back and I observe. So an enactment, you ask the family or the couple to discuss an issue. Then you sort of say, okay, here's a sequence that I saw. I literally do it on a whiteboard and draw it out as a sequence, and then we talk about the sequence. Then we ask, he would ask the family to just discuss the sequence, and then you try and help them to figure out ways that they could modify the sequence. Sometimes just being aware of a cycle that's going on is a really important part. I've often had people come back and say they couldn't do the same sequence again because they were conscious of it now. Sidebar, I would also prescribe the symptom. I would also ask them to try and do the cycle, and then that really messes them up. I also would change the meaning behind it. Like, I say, oh, okay, maybe they started this argument because they want to get to a place where you're able to talk about things, and you have to go through this conflict period in order to get to that point. So I change the meaning that the discussion has happened, and I'm sure some of that's coming from the influence of Mnuchin on my thinking. Okay, so some techniques: restructuring, symptom focusing, relabeling the symptoms. So instead of a rebellious child, maybe it's a child that's inviting engagement from the parents, or maybe it's not an argumentative couple, but a passionate couple. I often use, I'm not willing to really stop you from arguing, because I think arguing is a really healthy thing for a couple to do, but I will see if we can help you argue more effectively. Trying to alter the effect, you try to expand the symptom, you try to exaggerate the symptom, you try to de-emphasize the symptom. Maybe you're trying to, so if the focus has been on one problematic child, maybe I will focus my attention in the session on a different child. There's all kinds of things like you could do along those lines. Works for structural modification, usually working to reestablish corrected hierarchies. Developmentally appropriate hierarchies maybe is a more hearable way to say it. Challenge and correct faulty realities. Sometimes people just have incorrect information, and you help them using different techniques to become more aware of an accurate one. Create new subsystems. Like maybe there's been an enmeshed relationship between a father and a daughter, and so maybe I will focus on building more of a subsystem between the daughter and the brother. Yeah, something like that. And then I try and, Mnuchin would try and block dysfunctional transaction patterns, reinforce new family structures, and educate the family about change. Um, Structure. So organized patterns and predictable sequences are the main ways he's thinking about structure. These become family rules that exist in unmentioned covert family operating principles. So think about that. Think about your own family. What are some of the covert rules in your family? Rules that exist that everyone follows, but have never been discussed and never been written down, like yet everyone seems to know them. In subsystems, joining of members in small groups for the performance of functions, like maybe in a group, maybe I would have the whole family in there, but I would pull the two members of the family and have them do a process in front of the other. Or maybe I would give some sort of assignment, some homework that gets different subsystem to interact in new different ways. Okay, structural change equates with an increase in the complexity of the structure. It produces alternative ways of having transactions between people. Your role is, the role of therapists in general is, there's a preference for changing transactions in the therapy room where one can change the sequence of behaviors and create a different experience. Then you can give homework assignments on that. Often you'll have them do the enactments, interact differently. Like maybe they would act it out how they would normally do it. Then you would give them instruction on to how they might try it differently, and then they could practice it in the therapy room. Then you modify, enrich, and make the family structure more flexible. That's the objective. So when you think about like competencies, I was taking this, I used to teach the supervision course, so I took some of this from that. These are the competencies that supervisors are usually working with supervisees in order for them to feel confident in this. So I always think about competencies. Whatever model we're talking about, think about what are the competencies for this particular model. One is your ability to see structures. The ability to bring about structural change depends on your ability to see the structure. So you really want to be practicing, again, back to earlier, on content versus process. The goal is to be really good at looking at process, and particularly how they make a structure within a family. The therapist needs to find out how the family context, the structure, was contributing to the unresolved mourning and to the mother's ineffectiveness in one case. Okay, elicit context information is one way to perceive the structures. Other ways include the use of visual aids, such as mapping, which is one of the most common ones I do, a behavioral cycle, and the depiction of complex patterns. Therapists need to disrupt deep-seated assumptions about the explanations for dysfunctional behavior, the direction of change, and to challenge themselves and their own assumptions. You know, we got to be flexible with our ideas too. We have an initial impression, and then we sort of are testing that hypothesis, and then adapting our stories about families too while we gain new information. You got to learn how to join. Solution-focused therapy requires the cooperation of the family. It is an essential thing, and so it's essential for the therapist to participate actively in the formation of the therapeutic system, where he or she can temporarily join the family in a position of leadership. So I think of that as like they join sort of high-functioning, very active, and little by little they're taking less and less leadership. And letting the family do it. So conscious, purposeful joining, which enhances leadership and ability to promote change. Joining is an outgrowth of a positive attitude towards the family. You really are going to struggle to be an effective therapist if you can't find ways to value and appreciate the family. So you need to have curiosity about the inner workings of the family. For example, I wonder how this family will solve this problem. And I have faith that they have the competencies to be able to do that, but I'm curious about how they're going to go about solving it. Other competencies, an understanding of the complex therapeutic processes such as unbalancing or entering into multiple alliances. This is tricky. I mean, this is sometimes why people are hesitant to do family therapy and prefer to work with just individuals, because it's tricky to how do you honor and stay connected to each person. Again, I'm sorry to throw in a concept from another theory, but the most important concept I take from Naja's work is multi-directional partiality. If you can't be multiple have partiality towards each person, then you're not doing good therapy, is my theory. But that applies in all theories, I believe. So establish an awareness of the underlying patterns of interconnectedness. For example, what do you think the daughter is doing to keep the mom ineffective? Sorry, some of these quotes I'm taking from Mnuchin's own work, which you could criticize as he often was blaming in his theories, like many other therapists. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, though. And I'm sorry if you hear a baby crying. I think that should be done soon. The ability to have an alternative perspective utilizing structural concepts, for example, demarcating conceptual boundaries, a man's incompetence in choosing partners versus his competence in his role as a father. Like sometimes the focus is on negative and you're trying to help them find strength-based ways to see themselves in new ways and each other. Learning to challenge the mobilization of family resources, an essential feature of the structural approach to change, requires the active involvement of the therapist as a protagonist and not just a commenter. In order to challenge people, they have to feel like you care about them genuinely, and then when you have that, then they trust you to receive challenges. And by the way, I think this may not be true, but I think a lot of beginning therapists err too much on the side of thinking that they need to focus only on joining, and they don't realize that challenging can also be joining. People come to therapy because they want to experience change. So you could also think of the challenge piece as part of the continued joining because you care enough to engage with them. Maybe that's one way to think of it. Like joining, a good challenge is the natural result of an attitude, and it cannot be taught or learned as necessarily a technique. Good challenging strengthens joining by cementing the alliance between the therapist and the strength of the challenged individual. Think about it. Probably someone that you feel really cared about is also someone who lovingly is able to challenge you. Okay. If you're doing training around this, and hopefully you're getting some of this, I'm pretty sure you are. Live supervision. Mnuchin did live supervision. He would phone in to supervisees. He would call the supervisee out for a quick consultation. Sometimes he would go in and enter the therapy. When you watch the clips, there's three different clips. There's a pre-session, the session, and a post-session that you're going to watch this week. I think some of this will really come to life. So if the same goal can be achieved through any of these methods of intervention, the least disruptive should be chosen. For example, I came here because I wanted to tell the mother that, just like some small thing. You don't have to, this is an important part. You don't have to decimate the structure of a family. You need to find out the small sort of change that can be happen structurally so that the problem that they're experiencing can go away. Families are informed at the beginning of the treatment. The therapist is part of a team. They often work in a team approach, which provides a rationale for the intervention of the supervision and minimizes the negative impact on them. Yeah, I trust clients. They're actually more resilient. Sometimes we treat them as if they're so fragile, which I think can be part of maintaining some of the problems. You really want to protect the structural frame from homeostatic poles or destructive contents, and then you're going to deal with unexpected developments that happen as the case unfolds. If you start to notice something really problematic, then stop and intervene. You want to maximize the opportunity that you have with them in the session to help create structural changes. Really important competency in this approach is learning to enact, or helping people to enact. Identify relational patterns that need to change to help the family experience such change is both desirable and possible. The structural therapist looks at enactment as a building block to be used in the construction of a therapeutic reality. Enactments need to supply a clear stated goal. For example, once they are talking, watch for what makes it difficult for them to maintain focus. Did you notice that the son lowers his head when his dad starts lecturing? Give one of them to do something to do differently. And again, you don't have to change everything, and you just want to change enough to help things resolve.
Okay, that's everything for structural for today. I'm also going to give you a list of concepts and I want you to match them with the theorist. Oh, that's lovely. I think I'll leave that in. Have a great week.